Ellen Levy, one of my favorite people in the industry, not ed tech industry, in Silicon Valley. Really one of the gurus. I think if you look up, our series is Voices of Innovation. If you ask ChatGPT to actually draw a picture of a Voices of Innovation, you're probably going to get Ellen Levy or an Ellen Levy lookalike along the way. Voices of Innovation invites big thinkers with bold ideas who are here at the ASU GSV Summit to talk about the influence of technology in today's society and our future of education. I'm your host, Lev Gonick from Arizona State University. Let's jump in. Ellen, I want you to provide, the folks who are watching us, some of your impressions as someone who has been invited to a ringside seat inside the ed tech world. And we're lucky at ASU because you're an advisor to us. But share kind of what you're seeing at this gathering at ASU GSV and maybe just a little bit of a context in terms of how you've seen things evolve over the last 12 months or so.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words. Yeah, it's fascinating. Every year, ASU GSV more impressive. And so saying it's a culmination is probably not the right word, but a major milestone in the progression that I feel is more pronounced than usual this year is that it's not ed tech and it's not future of work and it's not just tech. It's that the natural convergence of these things is readily apparent. You can have a politician talking at the same time as you can have the head of a nonprofit as well as a teacher in third grade. And every one of them has an equal contribution to the conversation. And so bringing those together, I think, is more important than ever, but it seems more natural than ever.
So do you attribute that to kind of the maturity of the dialogue, or do you think it's kind of a moment in our history, or is the technology maturing in a way that is affording us this? What is the chemistry that is leading to that observation?
In rough swatches, I think you kind of hit on a couple of them. First of all, I don't think you could start a conference today that just said, today I'm going to do what ASU GSV does. I mean, it's been a long time in the making. And so even though it still gets billed as the top ed tech conference in the world, I think a lot of people in the industry and in the world have realized that education is not a silo, right? It's not only the thing that helps people get started in their lives and out into their careers, but it's a lifelong endeavor. And it happens when you're in your workplace, and it happens when you've retired and try to stay engaged in the world. And so this platform where you can already bring those together. And then you have the piece of technology, which is like it's the most extreme catalyst you might imagine for those conversations, because not only is it more potent than ever, but it's happening quicker than ever.
So I want to ask you, because, you have, a very interesting, again, experience and career along the way. I wanted to sort of ask, specifically here, you're like the ultimate connector, you're the ultimate networker. And when you sort of framed this moment as, you said, let's not call it culmination, but, it's a maturing stage that we've now hit here. Do you see that more broadly in the evolution of technology in Silicon Valley? Or is it still the case that, investors are looking typically for sort of product fit within a siloed understanding of kind of, what the sector looks like? Or I guess more generally, is the conversation here between K-12, higher education, and workforce blended together the way you've described it? Is that an anomaly to the way the technology world is seeing it? Or is there more synthesis and more convergence more broadly?
There's more, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it's still pretty siloed. Like if just a generalization, if you look at the world of venture, you'll have people known as ed tech investors. Now, lately they've become ed tech and future of work because those things go hand in hand and it's broadening out. There are people who invest in enterprise software. Well, what is software now? And what is the enterprise? And the enterprise has corporate learning. And so, but the investment groups, you still see that there's some silos. And in a different continuum, you still see silos. So for example, you still have investments going to really deep tech. I want that engineer, and one of those engineers is worth 100 other people. But at the same time, you see this convergence happening where you have some of the top founders who are very, very technically savvy saying there's a reason I also studied psychology, right? And understanding the human use and the human implications are going to be as important. So while you still see a premium put on like, oh, the technologist will rule the world, there's an equally strong, even if it's distinct set of conversations going, realizing there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, so I think one of the features at ASU GSV, and certainly at ASU, you can check me on this, is there is not only optimism, there's a growth mindset, there's an abundance mindset, which is certainly in the educational ecosystem a bit of a breath of fresh air, I guess is what I want to be saying. Certainly, at this moment in time. Do you see, again, I'm going to just ask you from your vantage point, is there, at this moment in time where, you're seeing all kinds of companies and individuals, founders and investors, is the mindset shifted more broadly in the technology space? Is the sort of exuberance that, we've heard over the last several years around AI, is that beginning to find root in the sense that real companies are being built on top of this core technology? Are people, scared out of their minds at this moment because things are getting gummed up because of, availability of or tolerance of investors and credit opportunities? Give us a sense of, whether or not what's special here is special, or whether or not there are ways for us to imagine what we're doing here in the context of, what at least historically has been a great vibe in Silicon Valley about, optimism, abundance, and growth.
I'll give a couple quick anecdotes.
Sure.
When, as you know, my career, I came out of grad school and it was Web 1.0. It was consumer internet was just starting, and it felt like a pretty potent wave. And this whole time I was sitting in Silicon Valley just out of good luck and circumstances. And then I did Web 2.0 and et cetera, social networking. And I was right at the start of that. And that was going to be the next big thing. And everyone piled in. And then everyone realized there's too many of us in this. They're not all going to survive. Right. And, there were companies saying, big Fortune 500 companies saying, I'm going to launch a social network. And you're like, that's awesome. It's not social and it's not a network. But you know what? Everyone wanted to pile in, right? And so in that regard, it feels like, in fact, I went back and read some of the history. And I remember when I was in Web 1.0 and I was reading the history, there was a book called something like The Victorian Internet. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
No, I don't know.
It's when the telegraph came along and how mind-blowing it was to people. Right. Like, this stuff, this is not going to work. And so you start to hear that it has similar characteristics every time something very disruptive comes along. I do feel like this is different, and everyone always says that. So I'm very aware that I am repeating.
And in what ways do you think that this is different? And I want to probe it.
Yeah, I always say when you start crossing human boundaries, to me, it feels like a step change, right? So for example, in education, when people were no longer going to have the same career within their lifetime, that they were going to change jobs within a lifetime, that changes things. Now, the fundamental unit isn't that one career is one job and one set of skills will get you there. And so that's one of them. If you think about AI, it's pushing past what human cognition is good at in many ways, right? Like we're saying, it's going to be
might end up being that path of machine development and its intersection with humans. It is in some ways the value proposition is that this is different.
Well, yeah. And again, you're talking to a person who got their degree in cognitive psychology. So I'm going to draw on something there, but I'll oversimplify it just in case I can make the point this way. So imagine you're hiring a plumber to come to your house, and the plumber comes, and if they fix your toilet, they did a good job. And if they don't fix the toilet, they did a bad job. So like good things happen, somebody did the right thing. Bad things happen, somebody did the wrong thing. And the technology we're building out now, AI, and this is wildly oversimplifying, is based on a probabilistic world.
Right.
What that means is I can do the right thing, put the right things into my system, get the answers out, make judgments on it, and act, and a bad thing can happen. It's 2 standard deviations from the mean, or it was probabilistic, and sometimes bad things happen out of probabilistically correct models. But we don't have accountability systems for that. We don't have, and so that's what I mean by it's getting out of sync with the way our brains want to work, how decision science works, how we make judgment and decision making as humans. And so you're going to have times where you're going to have to say, do I do what is empirically correct and the machine is calculating what's empirically
Right.
correct? Or do we do what humans perceive to be correct?
Mhm.
And if those things aren't lining up, and so that's one of those where we crossed over. And I think that's when it feels like a really fundamental shift.
Yeah, I've described it again in slightly more geological terms, but I think we're talking about the same thing, which is I talk about it being tectonic shifts.
Mhm.
And it turns out that, even though in the moment it feels like it's incredibly fast and incredible, you talk about it in terms of human cognition, it's not binary. It wasn't like yesterday we had total control
Right.
or, to use your example of, job stability, here's a quick data point and love your reaction to it. From 1950 to 1975, the average person who graduated with a college degree had 2 to 4 jobs. And from 1975 to 2000, they had between 8 and 10 jobs. And between 2000 and 2005, it grew to about 16, up to 16 jobs. And the anticipation from the Department of Labor is actually from 2025, effectively now for the next 25 years, it'll probably grow to 20. All of those are, we can see it as a disruptive moment, or we can see this as kind of continuity of the evolution of the way humans interact with, the economy and with the demand side of the needs of society, and with technology along the way. And my sense is that, I think you are what I would call a techno-pragmatist, not necessarily, woolly-eyed optimist, and definitely not among, the world's coming to an end. This is sort of the absolute cynics that are out there. But how do we begin to have conversations about those guardrails that you were talking about, so that we can basically say, rather than talking about the hype, which is kind of where I was starting with that question, which my sense is, we're going to be living with that for probably another 18 months or 2 years or something like that before we get a little bit of settling. How do we begin to make sure that, when we talk about security and privacy, that it's just more than just technical security and privacy, that it's actually about understanding the capacity of humans to understand where we sit in the broader scheme of things?
Yeah. Actually, to throw in one anecdote on top
Sure,
of your
please.
parallels of how many jobs people have over their lifetime. I mean, when I was on the team that was helping conceive of and found LinkedIn. I wasn't a founder, but it was there at the beginning. One of the stats that we had picked up on right from the beginning and inspired us was, I think it was the Chamber of Commerce. Somebody had just come out with a study that said the people graduating from college today will probably have 3.5 jobs by the time they're 10 years out.
Right.
And what that meant to us was, look, that means that you're going to have to kind of act like you are in your own small business. It used to be, I work for company X, and the reputation and the brand and the prestige all came bestowed by my company. But if I work for a one-person company and I'm just doing my scrappy own, how do you know who I am? How do I market? How do I build reputation? And so, you see waves of new companies when you start having that. And that was pretty rudimentary.
Sure.
So to answer your question, first of all, if you wanted to put me on that spectrum, I am so optimistic about some of the positives that can come out of it that I often find I'm not talking about them, because I think they're givens. I think, you turn to healthcare, you turn to a whole, but solving ways of getting energy, of managing resources, all those things, quality of life, that I find I'm much more focused on what could trip it up.
Right.
And so that part about focusing on what could go wrong, I think, is more critical than ever. It makes you sound like a cynic, but I'm not cynical.
No, I'm not. And so where do you see opportunity in that? So again, obviously these guardrails, dealing with it from, as you do, sort of from a human cognition perspective, where are there opportunities for innovators, creators, investors to actually invest in that to help scaffold the otherwise, technical machinery that's kind of is moving at, again, depending on how you see it, either very fast or over time, a pretty smooth line.
Yep. Well, so a couple of things. One, and I'll draw from some of the sessions. I just listened to the one where we had a whole bunch of people who'd been thinking about education, whether as governors or senators, and Kristen Sinema was talking and making a very compelling pitch saying we need to teach people how to be critical thinkers, not giving them the answers or the specific data points they will draw on, but how do you get to answers when there is not a truth? There's not an actual answer. You've got to work through a whole bunch of things. I think that's probably one of the most important. So like if you look at educators, I think that is one of the really critical pieces.
So one of the things that we're doing with Senator Sinema is that she just announced it today in the session that I was in. She's very busy human here today, that she is working with OpenAI to open a new center at ASU, which is focused in on neurodiversity. AI and learner success.
Yeah.
And it just strikes me that, she was quoting that basically on, when you take a look at the neurodiverse spectrum, that there are 30% of, people approaching college who have it, who deal with it, who live with it every day. And that we need to actually be using these systems to actually create the scaffolding for them. And maybe that's an example of a kind of very creative opportunity that Kirsten sees.
I think that's fantastic.
And
I did not know.
I don't know, and maybe there are other insights that you have on opportunities for people who are focused in on seeing the cognitive gap that is happening, and rather than simply acknowledging it, which I think a lot of founders in Silicon Valley, they sort of, we get it, but somebody else is going to have to solve for the ethical things or the bias things. And all that.
I mean, I think, again, I like to break things down so they're almost too painfully simplistic.
Please. I love that.
Especially right now in AI, I think it's actually
very helpful.
Questions. So for example, there's so many people saying AI will do this, AI will do this. And I almost jokingly go, it feels like if you're ever done finance or accounting, it's like the plug number, right? You're like, and everything else.
Your question is AI is the answer.
I will do that. Right. And you're like, no, but like how, and what does that mean? And so I always say, give me a day in the life. What's a day in the life of a teacher look like? Because you start to put together frameworks. Do we want them just to do stuff faster? And by making it faster, they free up some time to do more of the other things. Do we not want them to have to do it at all? Like, do we realize that they don't even need to train kids or lifelong learners on those things? So like, don't do it. There's so many ways you start to say, okay, but what is it I'm taking off their plate? What do I want the kids, learners, adults to take away?
I love that persona-driven kind of insight, a day in a life. I think
somebody gives you an example, go, okay, but what does that mean? Right. What does that mean? Because the cautionary note, and again, I look at it a lot from the education and ongoing skills development is, in grad school, when I was doing cognitive neuroscience, I looked a lot at the research on developing expertise. And, the simplified version of that is people have to do things 10,000 times. You have to experience it a lot. You have to build the cognitive muscle, whatever you want to think of it as. What happens when people aren't building their cognitive muscle? Right. And so because we can do it, you then realize what people in those scenarios aren't doing. Right. And some of them are super rudimentary, where taking the stuff people don't like off their plate is not always a good thing.
Right. So I think this is the really important. It's not so much as it's a cautionary. I see this as a huge opportunity for smart folks who are trying to see things holistically to understand that there's real opportunity in it. Next year, when we get together, as you look inside the crystal ball, what do you expect us to be able to, again, demonstrably look to in terms of, again, maturity or new insights, where you're sort of saying, if we do that, we're actually going to be moving things or moving the dial in a positive direction?
I mean, I don't know if it's a prediction versus a wish list.
But a quick wish list.
Very specifically, use cases of what people are actually doing, where you're actually figuring out that the rubber meets the road. Because when people want to say, what's your favorite AI application today? You hear about choosing my outfit for this, or telling a joke on stage, or doing a limerick, and those are all eye-opening for what the power of it is, but it hasn't been applied to the stuff we do. And you're getting hints of it this year. So I think it's very realistic that we'll keep seeing some of those. And the people who can do that at a systems level will help a lot, because they put the framework together. Love
that. And again, with a bit of a self-plug, I don't know if you've seen this, but this is ASU's AI journey. This is our second volume. Please take this with you. These are 40 stories of students actually putting into play, again, not just for courses, but for actually enterprise systems. We did one earlier with 60 stories of our faculty. And so I agree entirely with you that this is the maturity curve.
I'm just a little behind and catching up to where you are.
No, the maturity curve is actually a year from now. We've got to actually be moving from experimenting and playing, which is good. And we still got to do that towards these, again, built for scale.
The jury out prediction is, I can't tell yet whether the big guys are just going to get so much better that the little guys, it's going to be hard to figure out where those people all fit in as a business.
Let's come back next year and let's talk about it.
There you go. Hey, thank you so much.
What a treat.
Great.